if all the recommendations go as the Finance Committee is recommending, free cash, which currently has a balance of $287,000 in it, will end up with $707. Stabilization will end up with $146,000. Excuse me, we already voted the $250,000 in, so you can add $250,000. What? Oh, so we're on that article. I'm sorry. Ahead of myself. Okay, so I'm still right. So we'd end up with $146,000 left over. Some of the other issues that are going to come up is compensation change and negotiation items in the omnibus article that both the selectmen and the school committee are looking for. There's also an issue of an arbitration that was just settled with the firefighters that may cost us an additional $80,000, so about roughly $253,000. Well, what that will mean is that we would now be at a minus $106,000. Okay, so at that point, if we do transfer the money in from Hillview, we'll end up with $143,000 in stabilization. $143,000 in stabilization is not a lot of money. As a matter of fact, if anything substantial happens in the town where we have to spend more than that, we can't bond it, we'll be going for 2.5 override just to try to find some emergency situation. What I'm trying to show you, or trying to demonstrate here, was the fact that where we've gone, where we're going to go again, continuing in this meeting, and what we're faced with in the future. I've already talked about the Proposition 2.5 override. Okay. One of the other things we were looking at as the Finance Committee is the fact that in the past, whenever we used free cash or stabilization to fund line items within the omnibus article or the budget article, we always chose to pick a line item that might not cause controversy and that would pass a town meeting very easily, since it would require a 2/3 vote. And usually we would put it to pensions and benefits or debt or something that nobody would have any qualms with doing. This year we looked at where should we transfer the stabilization funds to? And we looked at some different issues. Do we try to transfer it to trash? Do we put it to pension and benefits again? Or do we put it to the areas of growth? And what we attempted to do, and I don't think we were as successful as we wanted to be, is we decided that we'd take stabilization, since it requires a 2/3 vote, and put it to the areas of the growth in the budgets, particularly the growth in new people, new staffing. We thought that by doing that, and it's not saying that we disagree with those staffing levels, it's just the fact of, well, if we put it as a 2/3 vote, we'll create more discussion on town meeting floor, and we'll, maybe force people to come up and work a little bit harder in justifying those increases in staffing. The last issue, hey, I can talk about the article we're on, is the fact of why the stabilization article is up front this year, in front of the omnibus article instead of down the back. Historically, you always have that article at the end of the warrant, so that any funding's left over, if town meeting so desires, you can move money into stabilization. Well, after some investigation, the Finance Committee determined, after talking to the Department of Revenue and Town Council and whatever, we have a real problem right now with getting funding out of the Hillview, since it is an enterprise fund. There are limitations on what that money can be used for, how it can be used, and we still don't know all the particulars. So what we're doing with this Article 9, is really taking the $250,000 and it's to reimburse the town for the money that the town put out of stabilization to start the Hillview. In fact, it's a payback. The Department of Revenue told us this is a good way to do it. This is the best way to do it, keeps it straightforward, the money goes back to where it came from. And that's why the article is where it is. Thank you very much. Any questions, or did I put everybody to sleep?
Before we go on, somebody left a pair of eyeglasses out front. They're in a plastic case, pearl. They seem to be regular eyeglasses, wire frame, non-bifocal. The owner can claim them from here. On discussion, let's first hear from the Board of Selectmen, Mr. Venezia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The Board of Selectmen unanimously recommends passage of this article. And I don't want to go over everything Mr. Dodge said, but essentially we agree with his premise. I see a lot of familiar faces out there, a lot of people who I deal with through the youth athletic programs. And I know you're all here for a very admirable reason. However, from the Board of Selectmen's perspective, from the Finance Committee's perspective, and from the School Committee's perspective, we have to look at the overall welfare of the town. And we've done that for the last 3 or 4 months, spending probably 100 hours going over this budget and going over these same figures you've seen tonight. And basically it comes down to a matter of priorities in this case. We cannot afford not to transfer this money into the stabilization account. We're getting very close to being broke. And right now, to earmark or to even consider earmarking that kind of money for recreational purposes is a luxury we can't afford. We're talking about vital services that need to be preserved in this town. From the government side, we feel that we are at the bare bones minimum of providing ambulance service, police service, firefighting services, administrative services at the town hall, Department of Public Works services. And we feel that this money belongs in stabilization not only because we have other priorities right now, but also because this is where the money came from in the first place. The committee's been established, and I think that a year from now, if this committee makes recommendations and if town meeting accepts those recommendations to earmark these monies, some or all of them, for recreational purposes in the future, it'll give us some time to make an adjustment and to determine how we're going to deal with that. But right now, it's the opinion of the Board of Selectmen that this money needs to go into stabilization to give us the bare bones minimum services and reserves that are going to be necessary to operate this town for fiscal 93. And would ask that you vote in favor of this article. Thank you.
Mr. Pasquale, please state your name and address, sir.
John Pasquale, 12 Hickory Lane. Mr. Moderator, I favor the transfer in the stabilization fund, but I'm having a big difficulty on page 61 with the definition of what the stabilization fund is. And I'm going to ask legal counsel because I have to deal with too many lawyers in the town on different boards. To me, capital expenditures was clearly put there. In industry, we say it's a fixed asset. What we're doing tonight, and I think this has to change, because we're now going to go, I got 4 other articles where stabilization comes up, Mr. Moderator. They are debt services. We're going to go for teachers' salaries. We're going to be going for personnel. So this, and I just heard my good friend, Mr. Dodge, say, originally, I'll paraphrase what he said, originally it was intended for one-time incurrence. So now we're using it for every purpose. Once this 250 gets in there, I feel this ought to be changed so people in the town understand. Because if it's capital, I'm going to ask the council, this is the wrong definition. If you would put the product on the market, Mr. Counselor, and you were selling something to the public and it didn't perform the way you want, this capital is illegal.
Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, Everett Motter again. Through you to this distinguished audience, there has been a recent change in the law. Up until very recently, and perhaps when this warrant was published, stabilization funds could only be expended by town meeting with a 2/3 vote, and only for those things for which a town meeting could authorize the borrowing of money, and that normally referred to capital expenditures. The legislature very recently changed that law as recently ago as about 3 months ago in December of 1991, and the law now reads that the stabilization fund may only be expended by a 2/3 vote of town meeting, but may be expended for any purpose for which the town can expend money. So it can be expended now under the new law for any purpose. but it still requires a two-thirds vote of town meeting in order to spend it.
Thank you, Mr. Counselor. Thank you for bringing that to the attention of the citizens of North Reading.
Mr. Mocheri.
If I may add to the comments on the stabilization fund, up to just recently, you could only use it for capital expenditures, as has been said. But what's been going on, if you look at the history of 2.5, as towns have run out of capability, savings accounts to apply against their general budget, the state has periodically changed the law to allow the towns to spend their reserves. The first reserve that we were allowed to spend for general government actually was a thing called overlay reserve, which goes back a couple of years, and it's been a historic savings account for the town, and we had probably at one time or another $1 million or so in that account, and we have used that up, and the way the law changed there was it was turned from overlay reserve directly into free cash so it could be spent at town meeting. We've used that money up. We're now on stabilization, and if we keep up with the way things are going as a result of what we're recommending even for this town meeting to come up with a balanced budget, next year potentially we're going to run out of stabilization funds too.
Mr. Walsh. I believe the question was whether it is mandatory for this repayment to go into the stabilization fund, Town Council.
Mr. Moderator, through you to the town meeting, the answer to the previous question is no. The money can be transferred back to the town general fund. The point here is that the money was advanced by the town at the time it happened to have come out of the stabilization fund. It was approved by town meeting to advance to the Hillview for purposes of startup costs. The return of that money to town by the town meeting is your choice. It does not have to go in the stabilization fund. It's my understanding the reason for putting it in the stabilization fund is merely to make it more difficult to spend it. Otherwise, it could go just in the general fund and it would be available for appropriation by a simple majority for any purpose.
Mr. Walsh, do you have a follow-up? Yes, you may.
I would then like to remind this town meeting and all the town boards that in 1988, when we were votes to vote for Hillview, one of the things that they promised us was that any monies made from Hillview would go back into the town, per se, the general fund. And the majority of people who voted for that, the simple majority, then would have the opportunity by simple majority to vote on this money and where it would go. Thus, I am opposed to putting this money in the stabilization fund and requiring 33 to 30% more people to vote to spend it than originally voted to put it out and take it back.
Mr. Hershey.
My question, Fran Hatch, Illinois, again. My recollection, Mr. Moderator, that $200,000 was originally stopped. I heard $250,000 as part of the motion. I just want to make sure that people understand that $50,000 of that is from interest that has been accrued. I don't know how the motion is worded, but I think it's important that we look at the motion to make sure that it's correct.
The chair will read the motion. Move to transfer the sum of $250,000 to the stabilization fund from the earnings of the Hillview Country Club. Said amount is reimbursement of funds advanced to the Hillview Commission under Article 4 of the special town meeting on January 19th, 1988. Mr. Walsh.
Mike Walsh, Duane Drive, and unfortunately the chairman of the Hillview Commission at the present moment. I'd like to answer Mr. Walsh on that. When the original $200,000 was removed from the Hillview as startup costs, that was done basically as a loan to the commission to get on their feet. And